Well, good morning to all. Good morning to you, John. Thank you for having us here at this very important Global Strategic Review Conference. It's a rare honor for us to be invited to such an event and to see the quality and the kind of people that is coming to this interesting discussion. Of course, I should focus myself on presenting you a little bit of what the Colombian case has been. What has been recent history? How are we confronting our current effort to bring this conflict to an end? And how are we looking to the future in terms of regional security and stability terms? First, let me remind you that in Colombia, we have had next year almost 50 years of conflict. Our conflict is maybe one of the few from the Cold War era. At the time, as everybody knows, several guerrilla movements in Latin America came to exist. And in practical terms, they did have some kind of political reason and some kind of a very well-defined ideology. And of course, we saw the consequence in many parts of Latin America. By the end of the 80s, early 90s, these guerrillas in Colombia and other paramilitary movements went to funding from drug trafficking. And that was very dramatic because in essence, while Cold War came to an end and guerrilla movements became an issue of the past, in Colombia, unfortunately, it escalated into a deeper and more complex conflict. But at the same time, these sources of funding corrupted the guerrilla ideology itself and moved them into a drug trafficking, transnational crime organizations in which child recruitment, forced abortion practice, terrorism, and concentration camps became their main capabilities and their main activities. It moved Colombia, by the end of the 90s, almost to a failed state. And that failed state was really crumbling from every perspective. At the time, Colombian people decided that we were not going to lose our country, that we were not going to give our country to the hands of criminals, to the hands of drug trafficking. Governments of the time decided to look for support. And they went to the US, they came to Europe, and they found different approaches of support. US support came specifically to enhance the security capabilities to bring back rule of law. And European nations gave a lot of support in terms of human rights, respect approach, legitimacy, and somehow state capability building. That's how we began to defeat terrorism. That's how we began to defeat drug trafficking. If you look numbers from today as compared to 10 years ago, every indicator has changed dramatically. In economic terms, you will see how much the economy changed. By the end of 1999, 2000, we had the economy at its lowest point in almost 70 years at that time. The economy decreased for the first time in that period. We had at that time something like a 4.5% decrease in the GDP. Inflation was 2 digits. And there was no almost private investment. It went to levels of 12% of GDP. And there was no foreign direct investment. We had at that time only $2 billion of foreign direct investment. What we have today is one of the most active economies in the Western Hemisphere, an average growth of 4.5 to 5% growth in the past 5 years. We have one of the highest rates of foreign direct investment in the region, one of the top in the world, above $15 billion per year. Inflation is 1 digit, below 5%, for almost 6 to 7 years. And there's almost no economic indicator that it does not look evolving. In social terms, which is even more important, poverty is starting to reduce. Inequality, for the first time in decades, is really showing better numbers. And all this was the consequence of improvement in security. By the year 2000, we had almost 28,000 homicides per year, 28,000 killings. By last year, we had below 15,000, which is still a huge number, and commit us to keep moving ahead, keep doing more. But certainly, we are almost half of what we were a decade ago, with an increased size of the population. At that time, in Colombia, we have 1,103,000 towns or municipalities. By the time, around 350 to 400 were almost in control, either of the FARC or the paramilitary or the ELN, the other terrorist group. And the mayors were not even able to present themselves onto their communities. As of today, we have presence on every municipality. We have control of every town. And I can tell you that only 8% of the towns in Colombia still see some kind of terrorist or subversive activity. 92% of the country does not have anymore that kind of terrorism activity that we used to have. There's a lot we have done, and there's clear progress on what we have. Our current president, President Santos, was a former Minister of Defense. I was actually his deputy. At that time, we made some changes in the strategy, and for the first time, we were able to take down the top leadership of the FARC, of the ELN, and certainly of some other paramilitary groups that were still active, or drug trafficking, criminal bands organizations. That is why when President Santos came as president 3 years ago, he decided to tell the country, starting first day in office, that we were going to develop a strategy to take the conflict to an end. We think we have the moral authority. We have been defeating this threat. We have been making this threat to the lowest point ever. But at the same time, we have to understand that conflict requires a holistic approach. And that's why we are working on different plans and strategies to bring the conflict to an end. That's how we began to work on a poverty and inequality reduction strategy. We, in essence, make some decisions like funding with public resources basic education for every child in Colombia. That's how we decide to begin a program for the younger kids, from 0 to 5 years old. We have a program now for them. We're trying to increase the funding for healthcare, and we are doing every effort to reduce or to invest on the most poor communities. The consequence is that for the first time, we have almost a 10% reduction on extreme poverty. We have a reduction on poverty itself as a whole. And the Gini coefficient finally seated for the first time in almost 3 decades. At the same time, we keep increasing the resources for poverty and inequality reduction. We are trying to make the economy more competitive. On one hand, we believe in free trade, and we believe in effective markets with effective state regulation. And that's how we have been able to sign several free trade agreements that are giving the opportunity to our people and to the economy to increase its performance. We have signed free trade agreements with Europe. We have signed free trade agreements with the US. We are signing free trade agreements with South Korea, with almost every country in the hemisphere. And we keep looking for other markets, for our products, and certainly to open our markets to other nations. At the same time, we are almost doubling the investment in infrastructure, looking forward to enhance the competitiveness of the economy. Then diplomacy becomes one of the most critical efforts of our strategy. As is well known, the region has been peaceful for a long time. Actually, Latin America is one of the most peaceful regions in the world. I think that's a very important asset that a region has compared to almost any other in the world. But at the same time, political differences are evident. In consequence, at a point it was clear, as a very well-regarded study from IISS was presented to the world, that some countries, at a point 5 years ago, we found that had some kind of ties with the FARC. Many thought that by supporting the FARC, they were supporting some kind of ideologic movement. But I think more and more people learning in the region and those countries are now clear that it's not just, or it was not just that the FARC became a criminal organization, a transnational crime structure, and in essence, they have been pulling back some kind of support and presence. But that came as a consequence of diplomacy effort. The first thing that President Santos' administration did was to regain our relations with our neighbors and to become more participant of regional issues and affairs. And somehow, nowadays, I think we're looking to contribute to world peace and stability from the UN Security Council, as we were being president of that council some 2 years ago, and by trying to contribute on every effort we can to be part of those world intentions. The fourth element of our strategy is reconciliation efforts. President Santos decided that we have to increase our efforts to recognize that our country has been in conflict for a long time and that there are victims from every side and from every perspective. So we move important resources through a victims law and land restitution law to give back to to those victims some recognition, both in economic terms, in resources, and as well on public recognition, which sometimes becomes even more important than any money you can give. I think that creates some appropriate environment in the country to note that we were able to move ahead. Certainly, from my own field, in order to support this strategy to end the conflict, we continue to strengthen our armed forces. We continue to enhance our military capabilities and offensive against terrorism, criminal bands, drug trafficking, or any other threat to the Colombian people that typically comes from crime and those kind of activities. So we put in place a new plan to continue the pressure. And that plan, Sword of Honor, has been able to reach all the base areas that sometimes were in control of the FARC-ELN or some kind of other criminal structure for 30 or 40 years ago. That pressure is becoming effective. In the past 3 years, we have killed, as part of military operations, the #1 and the #2 of the FARC, 47 of their top leaders, and we are demobilizing more than 1,000 per year, many of them recovering their lives, recovering their families, and being able to be included in the society and going back to have a legal life. We are capturing many of those. And in essence, this has been the consequence of mobility, intelligence, and very importantly, an effort on human rights, on international humanitarian law, really gaining legitimacy to our armed forces. Let me finalize by talking about the peace process. We have, as you see, a comprehensive strategy. We are still pressuring hard enough, and in consequence, President Santos started processing Cuba, in Havana. The process is underway, and we expect that the members of this organization that are already recognizing, according to themselves, that they cannot have any chance through armed struggle to achieve any objective, to really get into the pace of disarmament and to lead back their criminal activities. What will be important, and is currently the most important discussion in Colombia, is this equilibrium between justice and peace. That is what we're discussing right now, and that is what President Santos will discuss next week in New York in order to tell the world that we need to make our final push for peace, but we will need understanding from the world community about managing transitional justice. Thank you very much.